In this video, we are adding and subtracting rational expressions with like denominators. So notice we're still dealing with expressions. There is no equal sign and we're not solving. So the first thing that you need to look for is the denominator. So if we notice in the denominator, 2m plus 3 is the same number as 2m plus 3. That is one number. So when we are adding fractions, if the denominator is the same, we simply have to add the numerator. Because this is a plus sign, it's pretty straightforward. So this is the same thing as having one numerator, m plus 5m minus 6, and one denominator, 2m plus 3. So they share the same denominator, so there's only one. So the only thing we have to do now is we have to combine like terms, and our like terms are m plus 5m. So that gives us 6m minus 6 all over 2m plus 3. So there is nothing more that we can simplify, nothing I can divide out of the top and the bottom. So that is my final answer. However, we have to look at restrictions. So remember, for restrictions, that simply means our denominator cannot be 0 because we cannot divide by a 0. So that means our 2m plus 3 cannot equal 0. So we have to solve for m to see what the restriction is. So take the time. Some of you are just thinking it's -3, and it's not. Remember, you have to do the math. So I want m, not 2m. So my restriction is m cannot be negative, 3/2. That is my restriction on this denominator right here. And we always take it from the first one. It just happens that nothing happened to our denominator, so we just keep it like that. So let's look at this particular one. We have to be careful with this second one because of the minus here. So the subtraction is actually going to everything after it. So that is going to everything in that numerator. So it's probably helpful to go ahead and put that parentheses there. So notice our denominator is exactly the same. So I can write this out as one fraction. X squared plus 2x plus 10, common denominator means they share. And then I have my numerator, and I have to be careful here because this is x minus 5. And when I say you have to be careful, this negative gets multiplied or distributed into every term in the top. So that becomes minus x minus 5. So I go ahead and distribute that through before I write it out. Now the other thing that you have to be careful of are opposites and sames. So if I notice that this is a positive x, this is a negative x, so these two add together to be 0. They subtract each other out. But this is a minus 5 and a minus 5, which means that my final answer is -10 all over x squared plus 2x plus 10. Remember, this is one number. I cannot divide those two out to 1 because I have to add up all my terms in my denominator before I can divide. So this is in simplest terms. So now we have to look at our restriction, and I'm going to save you the agony of trying to factor this out. This is in fact prime, which means we can't factor it. But we still have to look to see if we have irrational roots or irrational restrictions on our denominator. which means that since we have a quadratic and it's prime, that means we have to use the quadratic formula. Okay, so our quadratic formula, if you remember, is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So what is our a, our b, and our c? Remember, we're just looking at the denominator. Our a is 1, our b is 2, and our c is 10. So when I go to put this into my quadratic formula, I get x cannot be, because remember we're talking about a restriction, negative 2 plus or minus the square root, b squared is 4, minus 4ac, sorry, I'm kind of like squeezing it in here, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. If we look at simplifying the inside here of our radical, we get negative 36 all over 2. Because it is negative 36, right here, our discriminant is negative. That means that this is an imaginary number. So this is an imaginary number, which means that there is no restrictions. So I'm just going to write that right here. So there's no restriction on the denominator because it has an imaginary number that would make it equal to 0. Okay? So there's no restrictions there. So let's look at our last one that we have here. Again, we have to be careful because we have this minus. So I recognize that that is going to get multiplied into the top. And I also notice that I have the same number in the denominator. So they share denominators, they have common denominators, so I can rewrite this as one fraction, x squared minus 2x minus 8. And then in the numerator, I have x minus 4, and then I have to remember, because this is a minus, I have to distribute that to everything inside, so that makes that negative x minus 2. Notice that only goes to the group immediately behind it. Okay? So once again, this doesn't always happen, but notice that my x's are total opposites, so they zero out. So then this means that this becomes negative 6, and this is x squared minus 2x minus 8. There is nothing that I can simplify here. So this is my final answer. But now I need to look at restrictions. So remember, my restrictions come from my denominator. In this case, I can factor. So when I factor x squared minus 2x minus 8, I get x minus 4 and x plus 2. So I have to set each factor equal to 0 because I don't want them to be 0. So x minus 4 cannot be 0, and x plus 2 cannot be 0, which means x cannot be 4, and x cannot be negative 2. So those there are my restrictions on my fractions, so I do not divide by 0. So I'm going to write here restrictions.